station, The Nigel Farage Show.
Mr. Nigel Farage.
Thank you, Donald, and good evening, everybody. Well, we've seen the amazing campaign that's been fought by Charlotte Caldwell, the mother of 12-year-old Billy Caldwell. And, of course, they came back, remember, from Canada with some cannabis oil, which helps the boy's epileptic condition. And, of course, that medicine was removed from them, but Home Secretary Sajid Javid decided, in this case, he'd make an exception and allow that cannabis oil to be given back to the family. Well, now it's also happened in the case of 6-year-old Alfie Dingley. And in response to all of this, Sajid Javid today said this in the House of Commons.
Cases like Billy's, Alfie Dingley's and others like it have shown that we now need to look more closely at the use of cannabis-based medicines in the healthcare sector in the UK. Because it has become clear to me since becoming Home Secretary that the position that we find ourselves in currently is not satisfactory. It's not satisfactory for the parents, it's not satisfactory for the doctors, and it's not satisfactory for me. I've now come to the conclusion that it is time to review the scheduling of cannabis.
So, a law looks like it's going to be changed, but Sajid Javid went on to say that he was clear that the government's position on the use of cannabis for recreation wasn't going to change.
This step is in no way a first step to the legalisation of cannabis for recreational use. This government has absolutely no plans to legalise cannabis, and the penalties for unauthorised supply and possession will remain unchanged.
So what is the law? The law is that cannabis is categorised as a Class B drug, and it's illegal to have it for possession and, of course, to give it away or even to sell it. And the law says that if you're caught in possession of cannabis, you can face up to 5 years in prison. If you're caught supplying it, you can face up to 14 years in prison. But, of course, there is a great deal of discretion exercised by the police in local areas. And I think one could argue that in many urban areas, a complete blind eye is now turned to people using cannabis. Interestingly, I have felt quite strongly on this issue for a number of years. For example, here's an interview I gave as leader of UKIP in 2013.
I think the war on drugs was lost many years ago, and drugs are now openly available, not just in the streets of London, but in little hamlets on the North Cornish coast. This isn't even an epidemic, it's endemic. The history of prohibition, as we saw with alcohol in America, is disastrous. I feel a huge amount of crime. They call it petty crime, but it's not so petty if it's your grandmother, is it, who's been bashed over the head and had a handbag taken. And I feel the more we can do to take drugs and the whole drugs industry out of the hands of the racketeers, the better.
Now, I felt that for a very, very long time. I've argued that on Question Time. I've argued that elsewhere. Interestingly, article today in the Daily Telegraph by Lord William Hague, where he has reached the same conclusion. Not only will it be right, medicinally, for cannabis oil to be used, but he thinks we need to completely rethink the thing. He takes the same view that I've taken for years, that effectively the war on drugs in the case of cannabis was lost many, many years ago, and that it might just be better to regulate it and to sell it. Now, I've always argued that what we need to have here is a genuine royal commission on the subject, because I'd like to really find out, in the States in America, where it's been decriminalised, in countries like Portugal, Switzerland, the Netherlands, what has the effect of changing the law on the recreational use of cannabis been? Has it meant that crime has gone down? Has it meant that more people actually use the stuff? But I do personally believe we need to open our minds. And all over the world, of course, the penalties for this vary. There are parts of the world, where, for example, Egypt, Indonesia, Malaysia, or the Philippines, where actually if you're caught selling cannabis, you can be sentenced to death, all the way through, as I say, to countries that have completely legalised its use. So the world is all over the place on this, and I think we're now all over the place on this. And I'm asking you, is the Home Secretary's decision to have a review on the medicinal use of cannabis, is this now a slippery slope towards the legalisation of cannabis for recreational purposes? And if you think, well, actually, once you legalise one part of it, you're inevitably heading to the full legalisation of cannabis. If you think that's bound to happen, call me on 0345 6060 973. Or maybe you think, actually, this is a disaster, given the psychological damage that cannabis is doing to so many of our young people, in which case text to 84850. Or maybe like me, you think we need to open our minds, have a Royal Commission and consider selling this product, in local chemists and getting taxes on it. And if that's how you feel, you can tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And of course, you can watch us on Facebook. I'm live here from New York City, and give us your opinions there too. And I want to make it clear, put my cards on the table, that I've never ever used cannabis. I've never smoked it. I've never wanted to. In fact, I hate what is now being sold as cannabis to so many of our youngsters, which in fact, of course, is skunk, which is about 25 times stronger in its resin form than cannabis. And I hate the psychological damage that it is doing to so many of our young people. I don't want to encourage people to use cannabis for recreational purposes, but I do think that if we were to do that, we might just take it out of the hands of the gangs, the crooks, the criminals. We might just free up a lot of police time, a lot of court time, and a lot of prison places. So I think there are potential benefits to thinking about this whole thing differently. I don't view what Sajid Javid has done today as being the slippery slope, though I've no doubt some of you will disagree with that very, very strongly indeed. Let's go to Kate in Kingston. Kate, good evening.
Good evening, Nigel.
So has the Home Secretary done the right thing, Kate?
Oh, absolutely. And medicinal use of cannabis should be legalised immediately.
Yep.
It is not a slippery slope. That's ridiculous.
Okay.
You have all kinds of opiates in prescription medicine, yet, the illegal forms of those drugs haven't been legalised. But what I really wanted to say was I absolutely strongly believe that recreational cannabis use should not be legalised.
Mm-hmm.
I agree with you that we should examine what's happened in the states and the countries where it has been legalised.
Yeah.
But in the absence of that information, I come firmly down on the side of not. And I've been listening to the cannabis debate all day.
Yep.
And a point that nobody has made is that teenagers love to do stuff that's naughty. Their modus operandi is to rebel. And one of the ways they rebel is by using cannabis. Mm-hmm. And by going to dark places and slipping a little bit in their pocket and then feeling very naughty, smoking it in the park. That's what my children and all their friends do. Mm-hmm. Now, if you legalise cannabis, all you're going to do is make those children go to the next level. Because cannabis won't be naughty anymore.
Okay, so you worry that it would lead to people going for harder stuff, yeah?
Yeah, I think the natural progression for kids would be cocaine.
But Kate, let me just counter you. Let me just counter you on this. A lot of what young kids are buying as cannabis isn't. It's this skunk-type resin that is 25 times stronger than cannabis. It's doing huge damage to our kids. If it was just cannabis they wanted, and they were buying the proper stuff, maybe there'd be less psychological harm in the country.
Yes, that was actually another point that I wanted to make, which is that, nobody's clear. We call it cannabis, and yet there are so many different types. There are so many different types, and I totally agree with you on skunk, for example.
Kate, can I meet you in the middle on this? Would you agree with me? And by the way, I'm not advocating we immediately decriminalise and legalise cannabis. I'm arguing we have a proper open debate about it. Would you meet me in the middle and say, why don't we have a proper Royal Commission on this to examine what the effect of legalisation of cannabis has been in states in America and countries around Europe?
Yeah, I would meet you in the middle on that, but I would want part of that investigation to be has the use of what I would call next level up drugs.
Yes.
Like E and cane. And,
yes, that would have to be a part of it. Nope, absolutely. I understand the point you're making beautifully. Kate, I thank you. Moving on to Sebastian in Islington, a new caller to the show. Good evening, Sebastian.
Good evening, Nigel. How are you?
I'm well. So what do you think?
I'm completely with you on this issue. I think it's quite interesting if you look at why cannabis was made illegal in the first place. And from my research, I believe it was a bootlegger in the States was lobbying various large organizations, including the UN, to actually make cannabis illegal. Mm-hmm. But there's no actually, I wouldn't say in comparison to alcohol, you could say that cannabis was worse for you at all. And in fact, alcohol is glamorized. It's promoted all over advertising, and it has a terrible effect on the NHS. And yet we don't take a practical approach to it.
I mean, Anita in Ramsgate sends this message in, Sebastian, by text. She says, alcohol is legal and does so much harm with domestic abuse, violence and child abuse, and I could go on. Cannabis does the opposite, says Anita from Ramsgate. Is she right?
She's got a point. I think what we need to talk about was, as you mentioned earlier, skunk.
Yeah.
And if you make something illegal, it's just like moonshine in prohibition time. You know, if you make something illegal, you're going to have people. It's just, cocaine's cut up. What is it? 2-3% purity on the street or whatever. All of this stuff is causing real damage, both to health. It's causing huge burdens on police. And you're fighting an uphill battle. People are always going to take drugs.
Daniel,
that's reality.
We lost the war on this years ago, in my view. Thank you very much indeed, Sebastian, for your call. And I get on Twitter, skunk you can get anytime, any place, and is probably the worst strongest type of cannabis you can get. Better to legalise it, and then you have control of it. Well, I find that a tempting argument. Some have said so far that if you make cannabis suddenly a substance that isn't naughty, people could move on to even stronger drugs. Don't know. Big debate. Let me know your views. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive on LBC, and it's now 7:15. Those of us advocating a rethink on cannabis laws in our country are not encouraging it. We're not saying to people, hey, this is good, this is completely harmless, because a lot of what is being sold now as cannabis actually isn't, and it's doing huge harm. And I get this anonymous text, and it's pretty sad. They say, I've smoked weed since I was 11 years old, and every day since I was about 15. I have extreme social anxiety that essentially left me with no quality of life. I try almost every day to quit smoking, but I have nothing else in my life. I am totally isolated. I am not saying everyone will have this, but if it's legal, a lot more will. It's pretty much destroyed my life, and I just wish I could quit. Well, that is a very, very sad message, but I wonder, whoever you are, whether what you've been smoking is cannabis or something very much stronger, because the experts I've spoken to tell me actually what people think is cannabis isn't, and it is doing huge psychotic damage. Nigel, I'm 17. My generation seems to think they're entitled to everything as well as legalising cannabis. We need to recognise that we can't always have it our way. There's a reason this is a Class B drug. It ruins lives. Simple as that. Civility must be defended. Well, Scott, okay, but you can drink yourself senseless and become very uncivil, and that's legal. I wonder, if alcohol was invented today, whether the government would allow it. I bet they wouldn't. Jordan is calling from Buxton, and a new caller to this show. Good evening, Jordan.
Good evening, Nigel.
So, we're well. I mean, this is a, it's a huge debate, this, Jordan, and it's fascinating that many countries in the world have completely legalised it, and there are still other countries in the world where if you deal it, you can be sentenced to death. So there's a very, very broad range of opinions around the world about what to do. The reason I want this Royal Commission is I think we've lost the war. I think it's in the hands of the criminals and the bad guys. I think so much of the stuff that's being sold is doing big mental damage to our youngsters. I think there may be a better way.
I couldn't agree more. And do you know what? Your previous caller stated that they wouldn't legalise full recreational use, and I completely disagree with that. If you look at the opposite recreational drug available on the market, alcohol and cigarettes.
Yep.
Now, it is well documented the deaths related to those two recreational drugs. There is no single death related to cannabis, directly related, that's ever been recorded in history.
I don't know. I'm not sure that's true, Jordan, is it?
On top of this as well, your previous text as well talked to a very sad story about an 11-year-old boy smoking weed for a very long time. Now, I say to you, where's the education? If we teach kids to not smoke and drink responsibly when they're older, why can't we teach kids to smoke cannabis responsibly? Why? Because if it's in the hands of criminals, unregulated, then of course everyone can get as much as they want, whenever they want, and that'll only ever lead to a bad thing. And on top of this, and the third layer of my reasoning for full recreational legality, is you only have to look at the numbers in Colorado, Canada, for the economic growth of those areas. I mean, this country, thanks to yourself, by the way, is about to go through its biggest political shift in about 30 years. Bottom line is we're about to lose one of our biggest trading partners we've ever had. We need more money coming in. And quite frankly, we need to create an industry out of this, because it's not just selling the drug itself. It's what that plant is capable of. It's capable of material. It's capable of everything. And
I was in Colorado, Jordan. I was in Colorado recently, where of course they have fully legalized cannabis, and where there are, and you're right, there are lots of small businesses setting up that are trading in cannabis and all sorts of cannabis products too. It's funny. I went outside a restaurant. And when I was in Colorado and lit a cigarette, to be told that I wasn't allowed to smoke within 25 feet of the doorway. So I worked it out. The only safe place I could go to smoke a cigarette was the middle of the road. And that in a state that's legalised cannabis, which I found a little bit ironic. So, Jordan, you think we should pick this up, embrace it, and turn an industry out of it?
We are missing one of the biggest and greatest business opportunities.
Interesting.
That ever presented itself. I mean, from everything from hemp concrete, not even just the cannabis itself, the hemp side of it, where it's not a psychoactive substance. It's actually material to be built with and to be transferred into so many different things. But because there's these laws surrounding the plant itself, we can't access that. I mean, hemp concrete, for example, is completely inflammable. It's fireproof. If you build all your houses out of hemp concrete...
Well, Jordan, I've never heard that before. They say you learn something new every day. I just have. Jordan, great call. Thank you. Nigel, you shouldn't legalise cannabis, as it makes it look okay to move on and take harder drugs. You can't keep legalising something that is wrong, says Kathy in Southampton. Kathy, I hear you. You're not the first person tonight that is saying that. One just has to listen to mild cannabis users' diction to understand the medium to long-term effects are severe. They are kidding themselves that damage is not occurring. They sound like old-time hippies, says Kevin in Sussex. And I get one from an employer here saying, I run a roofing company, and last year we employed a young lad and he was clearly smoking cannabis. Not only did he put me in an uncompromising position, not one other employee was willing to work with him. Such was their fear. You legalise cannabis, and us, the employers, will have to countenance measures with legal employment contracts. Interesting. Well, Paul in Muswell Hill is pretty worried about what that'll do to his workforce. All right, I hear what you're saying, but surely, isn't it the really, and tell me, help me with this, somebody, isn't it the really strong resin-based stuff that does the real harm? Daniel is calling from Barcelona, a new caller to the show, and Barcelona, Daniel, has relatively relaxed laws, is that right?
Yeah, that's true. I just wanted to let you know how things happen around here.
Yeah, do.
So it's sort of illegal to sell on the street like a drug dealer would, or traffic in the drug, or smoke it in public. But the way that the government kind of looks at it is that it's a personal thing that someone will choose to do. So what we have here is you can have up to 2 plants per person in your house, not facing towards the street so anyone can see, and children or anything like that. And we also have designated associations whereby you'll pay €20 for a yearly membership, and you can go in there. There's a pool table, nice sofas, they've got sports on, and people can recreationally use the drug in a safe place. And then obviously if people choose to smoke at home, they can do that as well.
Where do you buy the plants, Daniel? Is it like a sort of street flower market where you go and buy the plants? How does that work?
Not at all. As I mentioned, the 20 euros you go into the association that you pay for your yearly membership goes into the production of the plants. So they're made in an organic way. They're tested, so you know exactly how much THC is in them. And another thing that I would like to say, I found it very, very sad to hear the text message of that person who's obviously got some mental health issues. You know, unfortunately in the UK, mental health is so drastically underfunded. I fear that, you know, if a similar situation were to take place, and the health system in Spain is extremely good. I'm not sure if you know that, Nigel.
No, I don't.
It's extremely good. There's people out there to help people for mental health. You know, anyone can turn up. You don't have to prove that you're even an EU member to get health care. It's your sort of human right over here.
Daniel, can I ask you, Daniel, can I ask you, so do you have cannabis plants in your house?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And if you're smoking, I mean, am I right in saying that, whilst it's not good for you necessarily, that there is less damage, less harm caused by smoking the leaf itself than the resin base?
You know, I think you misunderstand the whole array of... Why don't you come over to Barcelona, Nigel, and I'll introduce you to my association?
Well, do you know what? I want to come to Barcelona because I'm really interested in the fact that these opposition leaders are all being locked up for daring to challenge not just Madrid but the EU. So do you know what? I may well be coming anyway, Daniel, and I've got a lot more to learn. Thank you for your call. Anonymous on Facebook, 30-year recreational user here, no problems ever, and own my own business. And I do hear that from people too. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusive in LBC. It is now 7:30, and so the Home Secretary Sajid Javid has spoken today in the House of Commons, and he said that we're on the road to rethinking legislation to allow cannabis to be used medicinally in our country. And this follows, of course, the very high-profile case of 12-year-old Billy Caldwell and his mother Charlotte, who's fought a relentless campaign to allow him to be treated with cannabis oil, which massively improves his epileptic situation, which is not good for the boy. Does that mean the slippery slope is open to us legalising cannabis for recreational use? I, as I say, have thought for many, many years we perhaps need a complete rethink on this. We're losing the war. But a funny one today. For the first time ever, I think I find myself on the side of Michel Barnier. Yeah, that's right, because the government say that they're going to take us out of the European Union, they're going to take us out of the single market, they're going to take us out of the customs union, and yet most of Mrs May's time appears to be spent trying to opt back in to various parts of the European Union, including the European arrest warrant. Now, I view this as an abomination. You know, you can, as a UK citizen, for something that is not even a crime in our country, be taken away on an EU arrest warrant, chucked in a Greek prison where you might spend a year before you even get a charge put in front of you. To me, the European arrest warrant goes against everything our legal code has stood for ever since Magna Carta. It is an abomination, and yet Theresa May and David Davis wanted to opt back into it, and Barnier today has said, no, you can't be part of the European arrest warrant system. All I can say, for once, is good. Right, getting back to this. James says it is far less dangerous than alcohol. I've smoked it 22 years. I have a good job and no long-term effects whatsoever. What does Reese in Luton, a new caller to this show, have to say? Good evening, Reese.
Good evening, Nigel. Big fan, and thanks for all your efforts with Brexit.
Well, I have to say, when I was leading UKIP, I had no dissension at all on my views on controlling our borders, no dissension on my views on getting back our fishing rights or leaving the European Union, but a lot of UKIP members felt my views on this subject were just plain wrong. In fact, many of them felt what we ought to do is get even tougher on people that consume cannabis. What do you think?
Well, I think that's part of the problem, Nigel. I mean, I smoked cannabis all the way from the early 90s right up until probably about 5 years ago. I only packed in because I'm a father of two kids now, married and work hard. I ain't got the time or money to do it. But at the same time, I saw it change. I mean, when I first started smoking it, it was the old school stuff. I think the youngsters call it original gangster now. I think they've renamed it. But I never had any problems. It was a thing that you did. It was almost like a hippie thing, really. You relaxed, you chilled out, you played computer games. You didn't get to the point where the alcohol got you to where you didn't know what you was doing or you was aggressive. It was just it was more of a mellow thing. I've even had opportunities where I've been to different places around the world and smoked cannabis, like Jamaica and Spain and places like that. And it's all completely different, no matter where you go, everything. But what I did see was now, sort of up until the point when I stopped, it changed. And I noticed it changed with the skunk type, and there's various different types of it. And even I myself, it would have a different effect. It wasn't the same effect. It still chilled you out, Melly. It still done the same thing, but there was almost like a devious side to it. And I honestly think the fact that it's illegal has allowed the black market, because there's no regulation in the black market like there would be under we legislate alcohol.
So if we was to legalise it, Reese, we'd sell the less harmful stuff. That's the point, isn't it?
That's the point, yeah. And I think at the end of the day, I know people will say, well, people will just turn to the street for the harder stuff. I don't think they would, because if you're sitting there and you think to yourself, I'm not thinking about the average idiot now. We're always going to have idiots no matter what. I'm talking about the average person who just wants to chill out, just like somebody would like to have a beer or a glass of wine or whatever. The average person's going to sit there and think, am I really going to go stand on the street corner and wait for a hoodie to come and drop off some really dodgy stuff that I don't know what's in it? Or shall I pop down to the local, let's just say, Dutch cafe and smoke a legitimate...
Yeah. Reese, you smoke regularly for 20 years, cannabis.
Yep.
Do you have any regrets about that?
No. To be honest, all I would say is that I saw the change. And I saw the change. No. And I think they don't have an alternative anymore. I think the youngsters now can only get that new
what is it? And Reese, you mentioned, you said you've got kids and you've got a new life, and it's actually very expensive. What would you have to pay typically now to buy cannabis, would you say?
Oh, I mean, my brother-in-law, he still smokes it, and I think he's paying like £10 per gram. Right.
And what would you get out of a gram, Reese?
I think he's probably smoked 2, maybe 3 if he stretched it, which, he gets extremely high, but the come down is relatively quicker than I remember anyway. I mean, I used to smoke and I would be mellow for a good few hours, whereas now they seem to get extremely high and come down within 20 minutes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, Reese, I don't know. It's illegal. I've done lots of really stupid things in my life, but cannabis isn't one of them. But you've got no regrets. But Reese, thank you. And Reese, rather backing up the point, that I've heard from people that actually the substance that people are smoking as cannabis has changed over the years. On Twitter I get, maybe recreational drugs can be considered as a sedative for disillusioned, low-paid young workers that will never be able to afford to have their own home like previous generations. These people I get on Twitter saying we shouldn't legalise cannabis forget that over 8,000 people every year die of liver cancer caused by alcohol abuse. That doesn't include those killed by drunk drivers, and those who die prematurely through alcohol excess, being hugely overweight, etc. One could go on. It's illegal to sell alcohol and cigarettes to under 18s. If they legalise cannabis, surely the same rules would apply. Therefore, drug dealers would target 16 and 17-year-olds. That is possibly true, but just because cigarettes and alcohol can't be sold to under 18s doesn't mean that on a very large scale many of them still use those products. Daniel from Shoreditch is another brand new caller to this show. Good evening, Daniel.
Hey, how's it going?
It's going all right. There are some very strong opinions, Daniel, on this. I mean, a lot of people think that actually what the Home Secretary has done, a lot of people do think it's a slippery slope and we should never allow the recreational use of cannabis, but frankly, I don't see how we can stop it. It's happening anyway, isn't it?
Yes, definitely. And everything's a slippery slope, but with regulations, everything can be worked out. The current problem right now that I'm seeing in Colorado is that with high THC counts, people can't actually handle it. So now they're going into the clubs requesting lower THC counts. So basically, when they legalized it, it came in with the waxes, the oils that were just really, really strong and high THC count. But what happened is the people couldn't handle it. They're getting too high, and they're now asking for more of a mellow high, right? They don't want that indica knockout high. They want that sativa, high.
So legalization is leading to people ordering weaker stuff, not stronger stuff. That's very interesting.
Well, at the beginning, they wanted stronger stuff, but as the stronger stuff came on the market, it was too strong. They wanted to actually have something weak, right? So during the day, if you're working, you don't want to have like a 28%, 38% THC count. You want maybe like a 5 or 10, something very low and mellow. Maybe in the evening when you're going to sleep, you might want a higher count.
Interesting. Daniel, it's a rotten phone line, which is a pity. I thank you for your call. And Daniel actually making the point that things in Colorado have evolved and they've changed. And I think this backs up my call. Let's have a proper Royal Commission on this subject. Let's examine what legalisation has done in other countries, and then perhaps we can make an informed opinion about whether continuing with this policy of prohibition is simply a waste of time and whether we should perhaps have a proper rethink. Let's do the research. Let's find out. Let's go to Lowestoft and ask Brendan. Brendan, good evening.
Oh, yeah. Good evening.
Hi, so what do you think?
I am strongly in the camp of legalising cannabis for medicinal purposes, 100%, from a legitimate source, government-produced, government-approved ways of getting hold of it. I have an issue with the people in the camp of legalise it completely and utterly for recreational, because the problem with it is you then have to police it in some terms the same way you would with alcohol. So obviously it would have to be illegal to drive whilst under the influence of cannabis, however you've obtained it. And I still don't think, personally, it would lead to the abolition, or however you'd like to put it, of the street dealer. I think the street dealer would still remain, because it's like how do you patrol who produces it? So if you legalise it recreationally, do you then legalise people to be able to grow it in their own homes? Or do you only legalise people to be able to get it from a reliable source?
Well, the point, the point, Brendan, the chap from Barcelona that rang in said that if you join an association in Barcelona, you can buy the plants and grow it at home. That, if you're going to legalise it, sounded vaguely sensible, didn't it?
It does sound sensible. What you then have to be able to patrol is, if somebody, say, is found in possession of cannabis, you then have to be able to patrol what is actually legitimate cannabis and what may actually still be what anybody might classify as skunk or stronger, or what would be an illegal strain of cannabis. Because we had the whole issue previously with the legal highs, and all that would happen is somebody would change a chemical element in a legal high, which was then made illegal, and then it would be re-legal because it was not quite the same chemical composition. So you've then got this whole issue with, well, this is my legal cannabis, officer, when actually it's not this legal cannabis, it's something you've got from somebody else. And this is the problem. Who you've got to be able to is never going to be clear cut. And I think if people want it for medical purposes, that's fantastic.
Well, nobody, Brendan, nobody has rung in or texted or tweeted in so far tonight to say the Home Secretary is wrong to have given these two young boys the medicinal use. Nobody has called in to say that. So I think there is a feeling that the law is going to change on the medicinal use of cannabis. And so I've not met any opposition to that so far this evening. I doubt there's much out there. When it comes to legalising cannabis for recreational use, Brendan, the biggest criticism I've heard so far tonight is if you legalise that, actually people will move on to harder drugs. How do you feel about that claim?
I, to be honest, I completely agree with it. I think that is what will happen, because I feel that, I mean, there may be what you ever want to call it, old school people out there, however you may want to word it, that would quite happily say, you know, I've got my cannabis from the chemist, blah, 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 and I'm quite happy to sit here in the evening and smoke this rather than maybe have a pint of beer, because I think actually that's probably more beneficial to society, because I actually don't like alcohol at all. I think it's incredibly harmful, which many of people, agree with that as a basis. But I still think that, people still turn to terrible drugs like ketamine and ecstasy and all sorts of stuff like that, crystal meth, because they always want the next step. They always want the big high. They always want the...
So is there an argument, Brendan, is there an argument that you just decriminalise the whole lot?
Unfortunately, no, because as much as it would then be readily available, who promotes it, who supplies it, who funds it, who produces it, and then you've got the government making tons of substances which we know can be harmless and also have the possibility to be incredibly beneficial, like the opiates. In
the right circumstances, they can be. No, absolutely. Brendan, it's complex, and you've laid that out. Thank you, Brendan from Lowestoft, for your call. You're listening to the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, and it's now 7:45. The Home Secretary Sajid Javid has sent the signal that the medicinal use of cannabis is very soon going to be legal. He does not want to extend that to recreational use. He wants to keep it listed as a Class B drug with potentially up to 5 years in prison for anyone that possesses it. But I'm asking, do you think it's a slippery slope if we were to decriminalise the use of cannabis, or actually is it the sensible thing to do given that prohibition is such a total, complete and utter failure? There needs to be a debate, to be fair, but everyone from growing up I remember who smoked weed regularly always seemed to be very lethargic, tired and not interested in life. And Jan says, my child started using cannabis at 16. He changed, became agitated. A drugs helpline said people often go on to stronger drugs. That happened. It was hell. Luckily, he's now off drugs altogether. It took a long time. We have to live in the real world. What next? The world has gone crazy. Jan, I do feel for you. I know so many of my friends, whose kids have gone off to university, who've started taking drugs, and who have been mentally, without doubt, very badly affected. I think prohibition is failing. I think we're wasting too much time and resources on drugs like cannabis. I think what's being sold as cannabis isn't. It's a lot stronger and doing a lot of harm. But the one real potential flaw to my argument is, if you decriminalise and legalise cannabis, does that just make people move on to the next stage? I don't know, which is why I want to have a Royal Commission to examine what has happened in states in America and other countries in Europe where this change in the law has occurred. Philip in Guildford, another new caller to the show. Good evening, Philip.
Good evening. I hope you'll find this relevant to the cannabis question.
Yeah.
A close relative, a very close relative, suffered with multiple sclerosis for 30 years and eventually died in her 50s from complications arising from the illness. The only thing that helped her pain, and it was quite severe, and we often saw her with this pain, was cannabis, smoked. The formal medical stuff, which was some form of liquid, did not help her. And there was no supply available that was legal. Luckily, she found a contact who treated her honestly and became a friend. He became a friend of the family. We still get Christmas cards from him, actually, 8 years after her death. But it is madness that this is not recognised, and madness that one has to break the law to get relief from a horrid condition.
But isn't this, Philip, isn't this what Sajid Javid is now taking us towards? That there will be, by the looks of it, the legalisation of cannabis products for medicinal use?
Well, I think it's going to be this stuff that was prescribed for my very close relative, which was in medicinal form.
Yeah.
And that did not help. It
Didn't
was.
work.
I don't know why. I'm not a medical person, but it was the smoked version that made all the difference for her. Now, occasionally, she ended up with skunk, perhaps by mistake, and that was clearly too strong. I don't think that ever created a habit-forming thing for her. But she suffered from this from her early 20s to her early 50s. And I'm absolutely genuine when I say we visited her every 2 or 3 weeks, and we spent the weekend with her.
Yeah.
And we knew her carers, and we knew her life intimately. And it was the only thing that made a difference.
And it really made a difference, Philip, yeah?
Totally made a difference. Totally.
And how do you feel, Philip, about the argument for the recreational use of cannabis? Do you think the law needs changing? Do you think prohibition is working?
Well, I think, like most open quotes, crime, close the quotes, there are various degrees to a crime. And I think in the same way, there are various levels of cannabis. and it shouldn't be difficult to to identify those which can be used for recreational use and those which are banned. Skunk is clearly a different animal
Absolutely.
to normal cannabis, and I think that should be...
So some form of legalisation, Philip, you would support?
Definitely.
Yeah. No, thank you. Listen, great call, and there we are. You know, someone there suffering badly from an illness who has to break the law, she in the past had to break the law to get relief from her symptoms. Edward on Facebook is a bit more optimistic. He says legalising cannabis separates the cannabis market from the market for harder drugs. Well, I hope that would be the effect if it happened. Akila says on Facebook, if they legalise cannabis, I will leave the country. I would be too ashamed of this country. I would not want anything to do with it. And Paul says, I've smoked it and found it relax me, help me sleep and stop my depression years ago. Gary in Croydon is another new caller. Good evening, Gary.
Hey, how's it going, Nigel?
It's going all right. How's it going with you?
Yeah, no, I can't complain. Getting on, busy, hustle and bustle, all that.
Right. And what would you do about the cannabis laws, Gary?
To be honest, as you can tell, I was born and raised in London. Yep. I've served in our forces as well. I've done 6 years as a combat medic.
Yeah.
I'm very proud of it, obviously, as you would. I don't even think the argument about whether it should be legalised medicinally is an argument.
Nobody, Gary, nobody has rung in and said that Sajid Javid is wrong to take us in this direction. So we can take that off the table. But what about the recreational use, Gary?
Well, I believe Canada's just changed their views on it, and there are certain states that have different views in America.
Yep.
I think if they made it recreational and legal, it would take onus off of the guys on the street selling it for a start, and it will be good all round. It will drop the price for the ones that are using it. Yep. It will stop the amount of police presence we have to put towards this at the moment for a drug that just doesn't cause any long-term effects. In the same way of drugs of the same class. It's classed as a Class B at the moment.
Yes.
I've never heard of it. I've never heard of many people, or ever, people dying of actually smoking.
Well, you're the second caller that's made that point, Gary. And Gary, tell us, where did you serve as a medic in the army?
Well, I was based in the UK for the majority.
Were you? Yeah. And how is Civvy Street compared to being in the army?
Completely different, strange.
Strange, okay. Gary, thank you for your call. I'm going to take one more quick call on this from Jay in Bournemouth. Good evening, Jay.
Hello, Nigel. Yeah, I'll come straight to the point. I think we need to get behind William Hague, actually. I think he's the only person I'm hearing talk any sense here. This has been going on for a very long time. I told your researcher that my friends that were smoking weed in the 70s, they're still smoking it today. The law hasn't changed their outlook on this. And I'm quite disappointed, actually, because if you remember back around 1970, 71, you had the then Prime Minister of Canada, Pierre Trudeau. He was thinking of he was thinking of changing the law back then and making it legal in Canada. And, of course, the American government came down really heavy on him at that time, and they decided not to go ahead with it. I can't believe here we are 2018. And we're still having this stupid debate, you know. And I said to your researcher, we could transform the NHS with the taxes from.
Well, it's a possibility, isn't it? Yeah, it's a possibility. We could.
Nigel, I remember the tobacco companies queuing up back in 71 when Trudeau was thinking of doing this to register names like Acapulco Goats and things like this. Everyone was getting excited about it. Everyone was getting really excited about it.
Jay, it's a big change, Jay. It's a big change for William Hague to come onto this territory. I've been arguing for over a decade we need a rethink on it. Jay, I thank you. I thank all of you. Now, interesting. European Commission delegated decision issued today, and something supported by the British government. Think about this. The European Investment Bank are going to start lending to Iranian companies. They will start this very soon with, as I say, the support of the UK government. This at the same time as American sanctions on Iran kick in on the 6th of August, which of course would completely forbid any lending of any kind to Iran or Iranian companies. So we are going with the European Union in an even bigger break I think, with the Americans here on foreign policy. I have to say I've no idea why we want to support a regime that backs Hezbollah, backs Hamas, and wants to spread their evil doctrine all over the Middle East and perhaps even all over the world. I'll tell you one thing. When the president comes in a few weeks' time, it's yet another issue on which there's going to be one hell of a rift. I'll be back tomorrow night at 7 p.m. At 10 o'clock this evening, it'll be Ian Collins, but up next, it's Clive Bull.
Nigel, thank you. Coming up at 9 later on.